Every summer between June and September, families across the United States would brace for what doctors in the 1800s called the dying season. Infant mortality spiked. Adults doubled over with stomach cramps after Sunday dinners. Entire neighborhoods fell sick from the same batch of milk or the same cut of beef from the same butcher on the same street corner. Then, in 1927, General Electric released a clunky white appliance with a motor bolted to the top. It cost about $300, which is roughly $5,400 in today's money. It hummed loud enough to rattle the dishes, and it quietly ended one of the longest-running health crises in American history. This is the story of the refrigerator, and it starts long before anyone had one. How does a country feed itself when nothing stays cold? That's the question every American household had to answer every single day for most of this country's history. The answer was salt. Lots of it. In colonial America and well into the 1800s, preserving food meant waging a constant war against decay, and salt was the primary weapon. Families packed pork and beef into barrels of brine, layering so much sodium chloride into the meat that it could survive months without rotting. The taste was brutal. Imagine biting into a piece of beef that's been sitting in what's essentially seawater concentrate for half a year. You'd soak it overnight before cooking just to make it edible. And even then, the flavor was more salt than meat. Smoking was the other go-to method. Most farms in 18th century America had a smokehouse on the property. A small wooden shack where strips of pork, fish, and venison hung above smoldering embers for weeks at a time. The smoke deposited chemicals onto the surface of the meat that slowed bacterial growth. It worked reasonably well, but it also meant your protein options for most of the year were limited to things that tasted like campfire. For dairy and eggs, there were spring houses. These were small stone buildings constructed directly over a natural spring where crocks of butter, milk, and eggs sat in the cold running water to stay cool. If you didn't live near a spring, you used a root cellar, an underground room where the earth kept temperatures at a steady 40-degree year-round. Root cellars were lifesavers for potatoes, carrots, turnips, and apples. For fresh meat and milk in August, they were almost useless. And that was the core problem. The methods that worked for winter storage fell apart in summer. Once temperatures climbed, bacteria multiplied at terrifying speed, and the only diagnostic tool anyone had was their nose. If it smelled fine, you ate it. If it smelled off, you cut the bad part away and ate the rest. There was no thermometer, no expiration date, no understanding of what bacteria even were. You just hoped for the best. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in 1805 could have predicted. That year, a 22-year-old from a wealthy Boston family named Frederick Tudor wrote something extraordinary in his diary. He and his brother William had decided to take the ice that formed naturally on their family's pond in Saugus, Massachusetts, cut it into blocks, load it onto a ship, and sell it to people in the Caribbean who had never once experienced anything cold. Everyone thought he was insane. The idea of shipping frozen water across the ocean to a tropical island and expecting someone to pay for it sounded like a prank. When Tudor loaded 130 tons of ice onto a ship called the Favorite at the docks in Charlestown and set sail for Martinique in 1806, the Boston Gazette ran the news with barely concealed laughter. "No joke," the paper wrote. "A vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation." It did prove slippery, at least at first. The residents of Martinique had no interest in buying frozen water. Tudor's brother hadn't found any buyers or even a building to store the ice in. The whole venture was a disaster, and Tudor returned to Boston humiliated and in debt. He tried again and failed again and tried again. He went to debtor's prison. He came back out and tried again. He wrote in his journal, "Let those laugh who win." And eventually, After years of figuring out how to insulate ice with sawdust and build proper ice houses in tropical ports, Frederick Tudor did start winning. By 1820, he was shipping ice to the West Indies and the American South. By 1833, he was sending it all the way to Calcutta, India. He gave free ice to bartenders in port cities because he understood something important about human behavior. Once someone has had a cold drink, Tudor realized, they'll never willingly go back to a warm one. He was right. Demand exploded. Tudor built ice houses in Havana, Jamaica, New Orleans, Charleston, Calcutta, Bombay, and Singapore. Within a few decades, ice had become the second most transported commodity on American ships, behind only cotton. By 1855, 12 companies were shipping ice out of the Boston area, all chasing the market Tudor had invented from scratch. He earned the nickname the Ice King, and by the time he died in 1864 at the age of 80, the industry he'd built was worth millions. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Tudor didn't just create a business, he created a dependency. Americans had tasted cold food and cold drinks, and they were never going back. By the 1860s, the icebox had become a fixture in middle-class American kitchens. These were insulated wooden cabinets, usually lined with tin or zinc, with a compartment at the top that held a large block of ice. A drip pan underneath collected the meltwater, which someone in the household had to empty every single day unless they wanted a puddle spreading across the kitchen floor. Women left cards outside their homes telling the iceman how much ice to deliver. Some houses even had a small door in the back wall behind the icebox, almost like a doggy door, so the iceman could slide the ice directly in without tracking mud through the house. By the time the Civil War started, roughly 2 to 3 of households in Boston and New York were receiving daily ice deliveries. The system worked, mostly. The problem was that iceboxes kept things cool, not cold. They slowed spoilage, but didn't stop it. A block of ice lasted about a week in good conditions, less if someone kept opening the box. And the ice itself was only as clean as the pond it came from. In growing cities with contaminated waterways, the ice could carry its own problems right into your kitchen. Worse, the whole arrangement depended on a steady supply of natural ice, which meant every warm winter created an ice famine. Shortages that left entire cities without a way to keep food from spoiling. During the ice famine of 1906, when ammonia supplies were diverted for other uses, New York City's poor were hit hardest, left with no affordable way to keep milk or meat safe in the summer heat. And the heat was the real killer. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Throughout the 19th century, the American food supply was, by modern standards, a quiet catastrophe. Summer was the worst. Bacteria thrived in the warmth, and without any reliable cold chain, food moved from farm to market to table in a state of accelerating decay. Meat arrived at butcher shops already turning. Milk traveled from rural dairies to city markets in unrefrigerated wagons, spending hours in the sun before anyone poured a glass. And the solutions people invented to extend shelf life were often worse than the spoilage itself. In the 1850s, New York City was hit by one of the worst food safety disasters in American history, and it targeted the most vulnerable population imaginable: babies. An estimated 8,000 infants were dying every year from uncontrollable diarrhea, and for years nobody could figure out why. Doctors blamed vague diseases, parents buried their children and mourned. The public shrugged. Then, in 1858, a journalist named Frank Leslie published a series of investigations in his illustrated newspaper that blew the whole thing open. The killer was milk. Specifically, swill milk, a horrifying product that came from cows penned up next to whiskey distilleries in Manhattan and Brooklyn. The distillers fed the cows their leftover grain mash because it was cheaper than real feed. The cows produced a thin, bluish milk that was barely recognizable as dairy. To make it look normal, producers whitened it with plaster of Paris, thickened it with starch and rotten eggs, and colored it with molasses. The result was a toxic product that looked just enough like real milk to fool a mother buying food for her infant. And it was killing thousands of children a year in New York City alone. People thought they had the full picture. They were wrong. The milk problem was just one piece of a much larger crisis. Across the country, the American food supply was riddled with adulteration. Pepper was padded with coconut shells and floor sweepings. Coffee was bulked up with ground acorns. And the preservatives that manufacturers used to keep food looking fresh on shelves were chemicals that no person would eat willingly. Borax, salicylic acid, copper sulfate, and most disturbingly, formaldehyde, the same chemical used to embalm dead bodies, was routinely added to meat and milk to slow decomposition. In 1898, the situation exploded into a national scandal. During the Spanish-American War, the United States Army shipped hundreds of tons of beef from Chicago's meatpacking giants, Armour, Swift, and Morris, to American soldiers fighting in Cuba. The meat arrived rotten, chemically treated, and in some cases literally toxic. Soldiers described the smell as similar to a dead human body injected with formaldehyde. General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the United States Army, tasted the beef himself and gave it a name that stuck. He called it embalmed beef. The meat caused an unrecorded number of deaths from dysentery and food poisoning, hitting hardest among troops already weakened by malaria and yellow fever. Disease during that war killed twice as many American soldiers as Spanish bullets did, and a significant portion of that disease came from the food the army was feeding its own men. So, yeah, not great. Enter Harvey Washington Wiley, a chemist from Indiana, who had been appointed chief of the Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Chemistry in 1883. Wiley had spent nearly 2 decades documenting how American food manufacturers were poisoning the public. He'd written reports. He'd given speeches. Nobody in Congress cared because the food industry was spending enormous sums lobbying senators to keep the government away from their business. So, Wiley decided to do something dramatic. In 1902, he recruited 12 healthy young men, mostly underpaid government clerks in their 20s, and offered them a deal: 3 home-cooked meals a day, 7 days a week for at least 6 months. Free medical checkups and $5 a month in spending money. The catch was that Wiley would be slowly poisoning them. His staff mixed borax into their butter, milk, and coffee. They hid formaldehyde in the meat. Copper sulfate went into the fruit pies. The volunteers knew exactly what they were signing up for. A sign posted outside the dining room read, "None but the brave can eat the fare." The newspapers loved it. They called the group the Poison Squad, and the story became a national sensation. The Christmas dinner menu in 1902 became legendary. Applesauce, borax; soup, borax; turkey, borax; canned string beans; sweet potatoes, borax; rice pudding, borax; milk, bread and butter; tea, coffee, a little borax. The results were grim. The borax trials showed clear digestive damage. When Wiley moved on to testing sodium sulfite, he had to stop the experiment halfway through because the volunteers were getting too sick. Only 3 of 12 men made it to the end of the sodium benzoate trial. Formaldehyde was linked to brain damage, liver damage, and kidney damage. The Poison Squad experiments ran for 4 years, and the media coverage turned public opinion into a tidal wave. 1 million women wrote letters to the White House demanding a federal food safety law. The food industry fought back with everything it had, funding friendly scientists and sympathetic senators. For a while, it looked like the lobbyists might win. Everything was in place. The food industry just didn't know what everything was building toward. In 1906, two things happened almost simultaneously that finally broke the dam. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel exposing the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking plants, and Harvey Wiley's Poison Squad data became impossible to ignore. Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which for the first time made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport adulterated or mislabeled food in the United States. It was the foundation of what would eventually become the Food and Drug Administration. The law was a breakthrough, but it was only half the solution. Regulations could stop companies from putting formaldehyde in your milk, but they couldn't stop bacteria from growing in your beef on a hot July afternoon. For that, you needed cold, reliable, consistent, mechanical cold. The science had actually existed for decades. Back in 1834, an American inventor named Jacob Perkins had built the world's first working vapor compression refrigeration system in London using ether as the coolant. The machine worked, but it was a clunky prototype that never found a commercial market. The real breakthrough came in 1876 when a German engineer named Carl von Linde, working at the Technical University of Munich, developed a practical refrigeration system that used ammonia. Linde's original motivation had nothing to do with food safety. He wanted to help German breweries control the temperature of their beer during fermentation, but the technology he created turned out to be useful for a lot more than lager. By the late 1800s, commercial refrigeration was spreading through meatpacking plants and breweries across America. Refrigerated railroad cars transformed how food moved across the country. For the first time, fresh beef from Chicago could arrive in New York still cold, but home refrigeration remained out of reach. The early machines were enormous, expensive, and genuinely dangerous. The coolant gases they used were toxic, which meant your refrigerator could actually kill you if it leaked. Even Albert Einstein got involved, designing a safer refrigerator in the 1920s. Though his design was eventually made obsolete by the discovery of better coolant gases. The turning point for the American household came in 1927 when General Electric released the Monitor Top refrigerator. Named for its resemblance to the gun turret on the Civil War ironclad warship, the USS Monitor, it was the first model that combined the compressor and the cold box into a single freestanding unit. It was loud. It ran hot. The exposed compressor on top radiated heat into the kitchen, and it cost about $300, which was a small fortune during the late 1920s. It sold over 1 million units. By the early 1930s, about 8% of American households owned a mechanical refrigerator. That number sounds small, but the trajectory was steep. As New Deal loans and rural electrification spread power lines across the country, and as the introduction of Freon made refrigerators safer and more efficient, adoption accelerated. By the end of the 1930s, 44% of American homes had one, right in the middle of the Great Depression. The refrigerator had become a symbol of middle-class life, associated with cleanliness, modernity, and proper household management. Advertisements in newspapers across the country pushed hard on the aspiration angle, selling not just an appliance, but an identity. After World War II, refrigerator ownership took off for good. By 1955, 80% of American homes had one. The consequences rippled through every corner of daily life. The corner grocery store, where families had shopped multiple times per week because nothing stayed fresh for long, gave way to the supermarket, where a single weekly trip could stock the kitchen for days. The iceman stopped making his rounds. So did the milkman. Frozen food went from a novelty to a staple. In 1953, Swanson introduced the TV dinner, and the American relationship with meals changed forever. The most dramatic shift, though, was in survival. Summer stopped being the dying season. Infant mortality from contaminated food plummeted. Food poisoning didn't disappear, and it still hasn't. The CDC estimates that roughly 48 million Americans get sick from contaminated food every year, and about 3,000 of them die. But compared to the 1800s, when an unrefrigerated summer could devastate entire neighborhoods, those numbers represent a world that's been fundamentally transformed. And that transformation came from a box in your kitchen that hums so quietly you forget it's there. It doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like furniture. But for most of human history, keeping food cold was either impossible or required an elaborate, fragile chain of frozen ponds, sawdust insulation, horse-drawn wagons, and daily deliveries that could fail at any point. The refrigerator's story isn't unique. It follows a pattern that repeats across almost every modern convenience we take for granted. Someone identifies a problem that everyone just accepts as normal. A few stubborn, slightly unhinged individuals spend decades trying to fix it, while everyone else laughs at them or ignores them. A crisis forces the issue. And then, slowly at first, and then all at once, the solution becomes so ordinary that future generations can't imagine life without it. The next time you open your refrigerator door at 2 in the morning for a glass of cold milk, consider that a century and a half ago, that simple act would have been impossible for almost every person alive. And for thousands of infants in New York City, the absence of what you're holding in your hand was a death sentence. We built a machine that makes cold air, and it saved more lives than most people will ever know.